Look at that. What you think bringing a dog makes you some kind of special ops. The cop laughed loudly, pressing the gun close to her face. This is our turf. Got it. Then pull the trigger, she replied coldly, eyes unblinking. And pray it doesn't tear out your throat before I get to you. Echo let out a deep growl, chain pulled tight. The crowd held its breath. What had started as a public humiliation had turned into a survival warning this time. She wasn't the one being hunted. Serena Miles stood in front of a small grocery store tucked in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. The midday sun filtered through the trees, casting shadows on the sidewalk where Echo, her military dog, sat tight against her left leg, eyes alert. Serena held the tactical fabric leash with a loose grip, neither tense nor slack. Every movement she made was deliberate, even when stopping to adjust the crossbody bag slipping off her shoulder. She had taken only 2 steps when a mocking voice rang out from the right. "Can't read the no dogs sign, Blake Horner." The county deputy chief stood there with a look of disdain, pointing at a crooked little sign stuck to the glass door. His words weren't a warning, they were a provocation. Serena turned her head, eyes steady. He's better trained than most people. Echo didn't move an inch. Seth Greer, the second officer, approached from behind, hands in his pockets, glancing at Echo before looking her over like she was some low-grade merchandise. "This is what you call trained," he said, half mocking, half probing. Serena didn't respond. She looked at Echo and gently set her shopping bag down by her feet. Blake stepped closer, pretending to inspect the contents. His breath carried the stale scent of cigarettes' eyes, narrowing at the sight of some frozen food baby formula and a few snacks. "What did you take from here? You pay with real money or with welfare?" he sneered, the tone dripping with contempt. Serena leaned slightly to the side, her voice calm and flat as still water. "I don't take from anyone. And I don't like people standing too close unless they're invited." Echo shifted slightly. Its body lowered, weight pressed into all 4 legs. Only those who had worked with combat dogs would recognize the subtle cue, a strike being held back. Serena gave a quiet command, Delta 3. Echo froze still as stone. Blake took a small step back, a flicker of unease in his eyes. A nearby boy squinted at the scene through his phone's camera lens. The air grew heavier. Greer scoffed and crouched slightly, hand resting loosely on the holstered gun at his hip. "What you gonna sick your dog on us? Careful, or you'll end up in a holding cell." Serena didn't respond right away. She simply placed one hand on Echo's head and pressed gently as if to say she didn't need to do anything, they were already revealing themselves. The store door behind her swung open. An older man stepped out, but when he saw a group of officers surrounding a black woman with a military dog, he quickly turned back inside like he'd witnessed something he knew better than to interrupt. Seeing this, Blake spoke louder. "What now? You live around here, or just came to stir things up and scurry off like a parasite?" Serena turned and looked him dead in the eye. "I came here because this is the only store within 5 miles that stocks food for dogs with joint injuries." She pointed at her bag. "And as for who's the parasite, I'll let this community decide." Greer narrowed his eyes, seemingly ready to fire back, but Echo's steady, piercing gaze stopped him cold. Blake still wouldn't stop. "The no-dog order applies to the entire block. You planning to let that thing attack kids? Has it bitten anyone? Is it even vaccinated?" Serena remained still, replying only, "He saved 3 lives in a rollover at Bagram Base. What about you? Ever saved anyone?" The air felt frozen. Blake stepped in closer, reaching as if to grab the leash. Echo didn't move, but every muscle was wound tight like a drawn bowstring. "Pull your hand back," Serena said quietly. "He's trained to wait for a command, but he also knows who the real threat is." Blake let out a dry laugh, but he didn't come any closer. He was starting to feel something stronger than his own smugness, a survival instinct triggered not by the woman, but by the unblinking animal in front of him. Greer glanced at his watch and muttered, "We're wasting time." Blake shot back, "It's not a waste. People like her need reminding who runs this neighborhood." Serena's lips curved slightly, not quite a smirk, not quite anger. "You can control paperwork, make up rules, slap on a badge, but you can't control the stare of a dog that's walked a battlefield." Blake scowled. "Are you challenging the police?" Serena replied. "I'm reminding you there are things you can't train like loyalty or silence." Echo remained motionless, but up close, Greer felt sweat starting to bead in his palms. He turned away, avoiding the dog's gaze like it was a mirror reflecting something he didn't want to see. A few people began to gather at the end of the block. A woman across the street raised her phone. Serena saw it and said nothing. Blake saw it too, and suddenly realized his little show of power was losing its easy audience. For a brief moment, he stepped back and pulled out his radio like he was checking for updates. But everyone knew he was trying to claw back control he'd already lost. Serena bent down to secure Echo's leash, her hand steady. "I'll leave," she said. "Not because I'm afraid of you, but because I know arrogance needs space to collapse on the one who puts it on display." Greer gave a silent laugh. Blake tightened his jaw, watching her walk away. Echo turned his head, once eyes quiet like a warning still waiting to be spoken. Serena had just stepped off the grocery store's front stoop when Blake Horner's voice rang out behind her like a hooked iron dragging close. "We need to search your vehicle. Got a tip about a black woman with a dog like that carrying illegal drugs." The words landed in broad daylight on a public street with people passing by sounding both brazen and familiar, the kind of accusation that needed no evidence, just skin color and a defiant look to justify tearing everything apart. Serena stopped, turned her hand still loosely holding Echo's leash. "What tip?" she asked, voice satchy like the heartbeat of someone who'd stopped fearing. "Or did you just make one up to find a reason to rip through what doesn't belong to you?" Greer appeared from somewhere, no questions, no announcement, and immediately bent to open the back of the small pickup Serena was using. The way he moved, quick, practiced, made it clear this wasn't his first time. He rummaged through a few boxes, pulled out a dog supply bag, a bottle of vitamins, then paused just long enough to make it feel like he'd found something off. Then he laughed, throwing his head back like he'd struck gold. "Nothing here, except this." In his hand was a cloudy plastic bag inside something like white powder that shifted as he tilted it. "Oops." Greer held it up, sunlight catching the bag like a perfectly planted piece of evidence. Serena didn't step forward. She didn't need to. Echo had shifted position, body, lowered upper lip, raised to reveal pale yellow teeth. A rough growl pulsed evenly from his chest. Greer laughed harder, as if the dog's reaction only made it more fun. Blake, standing nearby, suddenly stepped in, drew his gun, and aimed straight at Serena. The distance between the barrel and her temple was a single head tilt. "Tell the dog to back down," Blake said, each word landing like a pre-signed death warrant. "Unless you want both of you in jail for resisting law enforcement." Serena stared straight into the gun. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at Blake the way one might look at something too small to fear, but too dangerous to ignore. "If you're going to stage an arrest," she said, "you should learn to plant evidence better." Blake's grip tightened. Greer smirked. "The thing is, now it's in your vehicle, and the law doesn't teach how to tell real from fake when the cuffs go on." A woman across the street started recording. Her hands trembled slightly, but the camera stayed aimed at the cluster of officers and Serena. Blake didn't notice right away, but Serena did. She lowered her eyes to Echo and gave a slight flick of the wrist. The dog never took his eyes off the gun, but the growl softened. Greer stepped in closer, waving the powder bag in front of her like it was some kind of trophy. "Cocaine," or ketamine, you think?" he asked, tilting his head, pretending to guess, then clicking his tongue. "Not that it matters." Serena kept her gaze locked on his eyes. "It doesn't matter," she said softly, "because one day you'll have to say that again in court with a dog as the key witness." Blake growled. "I'm saying this once. Order it to lie down." Echo didn't move, but its gaze had shifted not on the gun anymore, but to Blake's wrist, where tendons had begun to bulge under the pressure of his grip. Serena said nothing more. She simply stood tall, letting the small insignia behind her military ID tag come into view, a Combat K9 unit emblem with an authentication mark that couldn't be faked. Blake saw it, but pretended not to. Greer paused slightly when he caught the reflection off the tag. He glanced at Blake, but said nothing. Serena tilted her head, her eyes boring into the space between the officer's contempt and their growing uncertainty. "I know you think you're in control, but when this video spreads, people will ask, why were drugs found exactly when searching a woman with no record, no history, who served in the military and whose dog holds an honorary certification?" Blake squinted. Greer began to grow restless, turning back toward the vehicle as if to escape the heat rising from the surrounding street. A middle-aged man walking past pulled out his phone too. Suddenly, everything that had felt like power, the gun, the threats, the planted evidence started to blur in the lens of the bystanders. Blake lowered his weapon, but not his tone. "I'll call for backup. You'd better brace yourself." Serena nodded. "The more the better. Lies become harder to reshape when too many ears are listening." Echo stayed beside her, breathing steady back, slightly tensed, as if waiting for a cue. Serena placed her hand on his head and whispered, "Stay ready." The dog sat, but its eyes tracked every movement Blake and Greer made. A second patrol car began rolling in from the far end of the street. Serena turned, pulled her phone from the inside pocket of her jacket. A few taps, and she opened the audio recorder that had been running since she left the store. Greer's voice, Blake's commands, Echo's growl, all captured clearly like a second version of the truth, no longer in police hands. Serena raised the phone high and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "The video and audio are backed up online. Any actions from this point forward will be streamed directly to the military legal office." Greer froze. Blake cursed under his breath, then turned toward the arriving patrol car, trying to look like he was just following procedure. A young officer stepped out, and the moment he saw Echo, he took half a step back. "That's a military dog," he murmured almost to himself. Serena turned to face him. "What's your name?" "Rawlings, ma'am." "Good. Record my license plate, activate your body cam, and request an internal affairs team on site immediately." Rawlings nodded, pulled out his device, and did exactly as she instructed. Blake barked, "You're taking her orders," Rawlings answered calmly. "She just triggered military personnel protection protocol." "I don't want to be part of a federal liability case, sir." Echo let out a low throaty hiss, just loud enough to chill anyone standing nearby. Serena didn't move. She knew the moment Greer raised that powder bag, the balance had shifted. Not because she had proof, but because they were too used to getting away with it, and she had survived by seeing things before they happened. Noise from the store spilled out like an oil slick. Customers from the cafe across the street had gotten up a few stepping closer to the sidewalk. A teenager in a hoodie held his phone high, recording everything. Greer spotted him immediately, striding over like someone used to dominating, not enforcing. "This is an active investigation scene. Kid, get out of here now." His voice was sharp, but lacked weight because now the eyes of the crowd were no longer afraid. They were starting to doubt. The boy stepped back, but kept filming, whispering to someone next to him. "The dog's calmer than that guy." Serena didn't move. She knew the threat had reached its limit. She looked at Blake, then at the plastic bag still dangling in Greer's hand. "If I command Echo to sit," she said slowly, "do you have the nerve to put that bag in your own pocket?" Blake squinted, about to speak, but her stare stopped him short. Greer let out a dry laugh, nodding like someone who knew exactly how to play the challenge. You think that's clever. This is a law enforcement investigation. No, Serena replied. This is abuse of power and an attempt to plant evidence. But the issue isn't the law, it's the choice. She stepped forward, half a step, her voice steady. I can tell this dog to step back, but if I do, are you willing to step forward? Echo remained in between his back, slightly arched head, lowered eyes tracking every movement Blake and Greer made. Even without a trained handler, anyone could see the absolute control at work. A faint hiss came from his throat, not a threat, but a final warning. Blake shrugged, laughing louder to cover the hesitation. Smart dog, he said, glancing at Echo, then looking Serena dead in the eye. But I'm not sure about you. A woman's voice rose from the crowd. She doesn't need to be smart, just more awake than you. Laughter broke out behind her. Greer spun around, ready to lash out, but did nothing under the weight of all the cameras aimed his way. An older man nearby shook his head. I served, he said. Military dogs don't react unless there's real danger. You're messing with something not found in any training manual. Blake turned back, his expression faltering for a second, but he kept his tone cocky. All we need is one reason. One wrong move is enough. Serena exhaled, eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. She didn't yell, she didn't plead. She just looked, and that look shifted the crowd from curious to alert. An older woman murmured, "That dog gets it more than they do." The words spread fast like a truth that didn't need proving. Blake could feel himself retreating not with his feet but with his power. Control was slipping through like sand between fingers. Greer began fumbling with the plastic bag, trying to find a way to hide it, but Echo's gaze stayed locked on him. Serena lowered her voice just enough for them to hear, "Everyone here is recording. Every word you say is stored. Whatever it costs to teach me a lesson today, it won't be as cheap as the last time." A little girl tugged on her mother's hand and asked, "Mom, the dog is protecting that lady, right?" The mother paused, then nodded softly as if afraid the truth might scare her child. "Yes, sweetheart, and it knows what to do when grown-ups don't do what's right." Serena turned to the girl and smiled. Echo hadn't moved. By now, even those who didn't know the law had begun to understand one thing: if Serena failed today, tomorrow it could be them staring down a gun and a lie. Blake turned to Greer. "We don't need this getting more complicated. Put the bag away." Greer hesitated. He wasn't used to being pushed into retreat, but Serena's subtle nod and Echo's poised stance told him the game had changed sides. He slipped the powder bag into his own pocket, pretending to secure it as evidence, but every lens had already captured the moment. Serena didn't move, didn't claim victory, didn't smile. She stood tall, as if trading part of her rage for a piece of survival. Echo sat down on silent command. No one clapped, but the silence around them had shifted like people had just witnessed something too real to dismiss. Rawlings stepped closer and spoke quietly to Blake. "Sir, there's more footage from a store camera across the street. They already uploaded it." Blake turned back to Serena, and his look had changed not out of respect, but from realizing that even with a gun, an arrest warrant, and a planted script, he still couldn't control the truth when it stood in the street with a dog that knew right from wrong. Serena opened her wallet and pulled out a faded military ID, the plastic edges slightly peeling, but the text and image still clear. She held it up, not loudly, not to show off, just a quiet act like muscle memory hardened by years in uniform. "I served," she said, her eyes not searching for recognition, in a place where dogs and people both deserved respect. Blake stepped closer, squinting at the card, then let out a loud laugh, the kind reserved for cheap jokes. "Probably fake," he sneered, jerking his head toward her. "Soldiers don't shop like this. Carrying bags, walking dogs. Who's buying that?" Greer shrugged, chiming in with a tone even more mocking. "Might be one of those dishonorably discharged types. She looks more like a barracks problem than someone on duty." The last word had barely left his mouth when Echo stood up without command. His body shot up like an arrow, legs lowered into a reactive stance. Fur raised down his spine, and a deep growl hit the pavement like stone against steel. Greer stepped back, back half a pace, then quickly masked the flinch with a sideways sneer. Serena tightened the leash, not yanking, just enough for Echo to feel the line. "Stay," she said in English, a single word, soft, like something spoken on a battlefield. Then she leaned slightly toward him, her voice lower. "We don't have to prove anything to them. A soldier doesn't need validation from men who carry guns without understanding what responsibility means. A combat dog doesn't need to snarl to command fear." Serena knew every glance, every tone, every gesture from the two officers aimed at one thing: erasure. To strip her worth, to make her easier to control. She didn't let them. Not by fighting back, but by holding herself like someone who had never bowed, not in boot camp, not under fire, not on a street where power was being misused. Blake still wasn't done. He looked at Echo like a malfunctioning prop. That dog's just as stubborn as its handler. But remember, dogs don't have rights under the law, and you've already crossed the line. Serena didn't reply. She just exhaled, lowered her head slightly toward Echo, whispered another command no one else heard, and the dog slowly lowered itself, eyes locked on Blake's hands. Greer glanced at Blake, shook his head. "This isn't worth it. The more we push, the more we end up on video." But Blake, burning with humiliation in front of the crowd, couldn't back off now. He jabbed a finger at Serena's ID and growled through his teeth. "That card means nothing. You're not in the military anymore. Out here, we are the law." A voice from the crowd broke through. "If you're the law, why are you so rattled by a card that means nothing?" It came from an older man in a white button-up, still holding a grocery bag. He wasn't loud, but his voice carried just enough. The murmuring started quiet, steady, like a network of resistance spreading out and taking root. Serena didn't turn her back on anyone, didn't try to win. She simply stood a line that would not bend. And in the middle of the two officers' mockery, it was her stillness that rattled them most. Echo shifted slightly forward, but not more than a single step. The leash went slack, then tightened again, a short, exact motion. Greer noticed the control and felt a chill run through him. Blake started to unravel, searching for an excuse, glancing around, but more phones were being raised by the second. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were studying, judging, and ready to share every detail. Serena put the ID card away slowly, like folding an old flag. "I don't need a card to prove what's right or wrong," she said. "You're proving that to yourselves by the way you've treated me. And this dog?" Blake stepped closer, leaning in, his voice dripping with mockery. "If you were really a soldier, you'd know what command means. Around here, the orders come from me." Serena didn't move. "I know exactly what a command is. I also know when it's being abused to cover insecurity." Greer exhaled sharply, turning away to take a few steps, as if he wanted to back out, couldn't find a reason. Serena glanced at him for a second, then returned her eyes to Blake. "You want me to make a mistake, but the thing is, I don't need to win. I just need you to show people who you are." A young woman in the crowd spoke up, and they've done a great job of that. A few small laughs rippled through the bystanders. Blake snapped, "Clear out, this is an investigation." But this time his voice landed thin, like the last breeze of the day. Serena placed her hand on Echo's head palm, pressing gently into the fur at his neck. "We don't need to beat them," she whispered, just loud enough for the dog to hear. "We just need them to trample their own idea of justice." She wasn't a hero, but to those watching, she held on to something many had forgotten: calm in the prison of words, and the belief that truth can stand even when no one wants to hear it. Greer moved behind Serena, arm extended, pulling out the handcuffs without any attempt to hide it. The metallic click echoed through the thickening air. He grabbed her wrist, pulled it back, and pressed lightly on her shoulder to tilt her forward. Serena didn't resist. She let her body go loose, her eyes still on Echo, as if the real tension wasn't about being arrested, but about keeping her dog from acting before it was necessary. Her arms were pulled behind her, the cold steel wrapped her wrist, relaxed, but her breathing stayed steady. Greer frowned like he was waiting for something instinctive, a jerk, a protest, but nothing came. Blake stepped closer, standing just beside Serena, close enough that no one else could hear him. He leaned in, his voice low and full of venom. "You see, that dog of yours can't save you now." He spoke like he had just claimed some personal victory, as if cuffing a woman who didn't resist was proof that his power was legitimate. His hand pressed against the back of Serena's neck, applying just enough pressure to force her posture lower in front of the crowd. But the growl cut that moment clean. Echo made a sound that wasn't from an ordinary dog, but a deep reverberating tone meant to intimidate, the kind only dogs trained in military environments make when they sense the threshold of safety has been crossed. The dog surged forward in a single stride, slicing through the air, planting himself fully between Serena and the two officers. His front paws hit the pavement, body locked forward, head raised, the growl steady and grinding like an engine waiting to rev. Blake stepped back. Greer did too. No one told them to. But the human body knows when to recoil, especially in front of something with muscle commands and the memory of war. Echo didn't attack. He simply stood there, a wall between Serena and the hands holding Cuff's guns and intentions to make her a warning. The whole block held its breath. Phone cameras clicked in chorus, not one but dozen, as if everyone understood this was the moment that couldn't go unrecorded. Serena didn't turn. She just spoke softly, low enough for only those close by to hear Echo hold. Just two words, without anger, without urgency, without force, more like a message that no matter what, she was still in control, still choosing how to respond. Echo kept growling, but now the sound was more warning than threat. He didn't move. He didn't bite. He just stood there, forcing both officers into a defensive stance. Blake's hand still hovered near his gun, but he didn't dare raise it. His eyes scanned the street eyes of someone who knew he was being filmed from every angle, who knew any misstep could turn him into the center of a viral video within minutes. Greer swallowed hard, his expression uneasy. Serena remained still, hands cuffed behind her, but her posture straight as a drawn line. A voice from the crowd called out, "Cops, pin down a veteran and get checked by a military dog. That's something." The comment came from a distance, but it was enough to spark a few quiet chuckles. No one shouted, no one screamed, but the atmosphere had started to shift, and that shift didn't come from Serena. It came from the two officers who had unknowingly pushed everything to the edge. Blake lowered his gun, not fully, but enough to show he had reassessed the situation. Greer hunched down, pretending to check a pocket, but really just avoiding Echo's eyes. A child whispered to his mother, "That dog's protecting the lady." The mother placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes fixed on Serena. "He knows who's right." The murmurs began to build. Serena knew her silence and Echo's reaction had turned the image of suspect in custody into someone being defended. Blake turned to Greer. "She's cuffed. Now what?" It wasn't a real question, just a way to snap Greer out of his freeze. But Greer didn't respond. He only glanced at the crowd, then at Echo, his gaze no longer arrogant but carrying something closer to regret, not yet strong enough to become action. Serena spoke quietly to no one in particular. "You have the right to cuff me, but you know exactly why you're being recorded." Blake bit his lip, ready to snap back, but held it in. Echo stayed where he was, still blocking. Still the line no one dared to cross. Still the boundary kept abuse from advancing another inch. Serena slowly lifted her head. Her eyes didn't glare, didn't sharpen, but something in them slowed the moment around her. She was cuffed, but what people saw was a woman commanding the situation with a calm so resolute no one dared step forward. For a few seconds, the power wasn't in the gun or the cuffs. It was in the leash and in the one who held it, even if her hands were bound. The story wasn't over, but it had shifted, and the watchers, the filmers, the passers-by, the young mother, the boy standing near the post office, they all felt it. Serena didn't need to draw a weapon. Echo didn't need to bite, and justice hadn't arrived. But for the first time, the crowd had stopped stopped being afraid and started looking directly. And the two officers, they began to understand that what made them hesitate wasn't the dog. It was something they'd never been taught in training: purposeful silence, and a growl strong enough to pull control out of their hands. In just a few hours, a 2-minute video titled "Cops Tease Military Dog, Then Panic and Back Off" spread at lightning speed across every social media platform. At first, it appeared only on the account of a teenager who lived near the grocery store, the one who had recorded the entire sequence from the moment Serena was questioned to the instant Echo growled and stepped between her and the handcuffs. But what made the video explode wasn't the argument. It was the moment both officers stepped back while the dog didn't move. The growl hit like it echoed straight through the viewer's chest, and the clicking of the cuffs became background music to what people began calling resistance done right, right place, right time, right person. Online viewers didn't need experts to decode the footage. In a few slowed-down frames, people caught the detail of the plastic drug bag Greer held up while searching Serena's trunk, a rushed exaggeration so clumsy it was almost laughable. The camera's angle happened to catch sunlight slanting through the translucent bag just right, revealing faint lettering on the back: dog treat, beef flavor, bonus pack, and the logo of a local supermarket chain. Turned out, the evidence was a promotional chew toy for dogs, part of a weekend sale. Dog owners quickly confirmed it was a common faux medicinal treat sold in flashy bags, easily mistaken if you weren't looking closely. But no one mistook it except someone who meant to, as the first comments rolled in a domino effect followed. Others who had been stopped or searched without cause by police in the same town began posting their own stories. One recalled being detained in a grocery store parking lot last month. Another described being threatened over a suspicious-looking shopping bag. Coincidence stopped feeling like a coincidence. And the names Blake Horner and Greer Fletch started showing up across angry posts again and again. The question shifted from "what did Serena do wrong" to "how many times has this happened without being caught on camera?" A local reporter found Serena after Echo's routine vet appointment. No press team, no mics sticking out from major networks, just a young woman holding a camera, asking in a plain voice, "Do you think they were scared of the dog, or of people seeing who they really are?" The question wasn't cruel, but it wasn't soft either. Serena stood in a brick-paved courtyard, one hand resting lightly on Echo's leash, either to steady herself or to mark the line between her and those who always tried to cross it. She didn't answer right away, and she didn't dodge it. Her eyes didn't go to the lens, they went to Echo lying calmly beside her, ears still perked. Serena, crouched down, touched his head, a slow stroke that felt like thanks or comfort. Echo tilted his head slightly, his eyes not reacting but scanning like he was reading the room. And that single gesture became the strongest answer of all. Some things don't need explaining. People who use excuses to push others down are always afraid of being pulled into the light, especially when that light comes from things they can't control: a camera, a dog, a woman who doesn't respond with anger. On the largest video sharing platform, the clip was reposted with the title, "They framed her, but her dog knew better." Viewers replayed the moment Echo growled, rewound to the frame where Blake stepped back, and again when Serena whispered, "Hold," and Echo stopped like a wall. Among tens of thousands of comments, many didn't talk about the police, didn't talk about racism. They talked about composure. "I wish I had her calm knowing I was being set up and still choosing not to strike back," one comment read. The city where Serena lived had never appeared on the map of major protests. But a few days later, graffiti appeared on the wall outside the police station. Bold letters stretching across 10 feet of brick: "A dog can tell right from wrong." "What's your excuse?" And by then, it was no longer a story about a bag of dog treats. Serena gave no interviews, appeared on no news broadcasts, and offered no clarifications or explanations. She kept walking with Echo each morning, sitting on a park bench reading her book, but people passing by lingered a little longer. Their glances no longer carried suspicion but recognition. They didn't need to know her name. They only needed to remember she didn't step back when she was pushed. Echo, once a retired military dog, had become an icon no one had seen coming. He didn't need to wear armor or carry a training badge, just one growl, and he held the line. The same way justice sometimes needs to show up silent, firm, and beyond anyone's control. Blake sat back in a plastic chair outside the county police station, holding an unopened can of soda. Around him were reporters' cameras and expectant stares. He tugged the brim of his cap and gave a smug smile. "She controls a dog with military passwords. Who knows? Could be a terrorist. We were just following protocol." Greer stood behind him, arms crossed, nodding along. Less than 24 hours after the incident, they had turned the entire encounter into a comedy act for the media. Greer kept pushing the narrative in their favor. In a live stream on his personal account, he reenacted the moment Serena stepped back while being cuffed, mocking her. "I'm telling you, that dog jumped up barking like crazy. I had to step in between it, and Blake saved her from getting shot. You're welcome." Laughing emojis flooded the comments. A few accounts cheered them on, calling the two officers heroes, but the angry reaction emojis vastly outnumbered them. Meanwhile, on K9 training forums, a very different clip was going viral. Serena sitting in the shade, eyes cold, Echo beside her, ears alert, letting out a low growl without losing control. A military dog trainer, formerly part of a special K9 unit, spoke up. "That's not aggression. That's standard protective posture." The dog reacted with perfect discipline based on threat level. If it had been trained to attack, those two officers wouldn't be standing there live streaming. The post came with a sharp caption. "The dog showed more discipline than the ones in uniform." In the comments, someone wrote, "I served in Kandahar. Dogs like Echo are trained to assess a situation before biting. If he stood still, it meant he was waiting on command. And if a command came, congrats, the target wouldn't get a word out." A viral news caption read, "Cops lie more than handlers train dogs." Another outlet ran with a simpler headline, "Who deserves the leash more?" Greer tried to salvage his image by appearing on local news wearing a neatly pressed uniform and taking a solemn tone. "We acted for the community. Every precaution was about public safety." But when the host asked, "Can you confirm the plastic bag was a legitimate piece of evidence?" Greer's eyes flickered. He changed the subject. "That item needs further investigation." But the dog's reaction showed the situation could have spiraled. Meanwhile, Serena stayed out of the spotlight. No interviews, no live streams. She walked Echo early before the streets woke, avoiding all crowd. Yet her silence made her image even clearer. A black woman, a former soldier, leading a K9, both staying calm through insult entrapment and still refusing to let go of the leash that held their dignity. A Reddit post put it plainly. They mocked her because they thought she'd lash out, scream, break down. But Echo didn't bite, and she didn't say a word. They had no idea what to do when no one reacted the way they expected. Another clip edited from Greer's livestream was paired with the moment Serena whispered, "Stay." Echo gave a low growl, then stood still. The overlay read, "When the calmest one is the dog." Inside the next press briefing, the county sheriff was forced to speak. "We will be reviewing the arrest procedure. No one is above the law, not even law enforcement." But those words weren't strong enough to cool the anger spreading across the public. People held a candlelight vigil in front of the city hall. No chants, no banners, just silence, standing together carrying prints of Echo eyes, sharp stance, firm, a symbol of the discipline and dignity the whole society was aching for. At the edge of the grass, a little girl asked her mother, "Mom, did the dog get arrested?" The mother knelt beside her. "No, because he didn't do anything wrong, and because someone taught him when to stand and when to stay still." A reporter from an independent news outlet found Serena at an animal rescue center where she volunteered weekly. He asked, "Do you think those two officers feared the dog, or feared being seen for who they really are?" Serena didn't answer. She just sat down beside Echo, her hand resting gently on his head. No statement, no defense, no clarification. When the powerful speak to deny the strongest one in the room is often the one who says nothing, and in this case it was a dog trained to survive, not to entertain. This story didn't erupt with bloodshed or shouting. It spread through the stare of a dog that never looked away from its handler, through the unflinching stance of a black woman standing in front of two drawn weapons, and through the silence they held while those in power shouted to make themselves right. Echo never attacked, but from the moment he placed himself between his handler and the cuffs, he taught people what loyalty looks like, and what boundary a civilized society should never cross, no matter what uniform someone wears. The first post didn't come from a journalist or expert. It came from a student named Diego, a third-year environmental engineering major at the University of Riverside. He wrote, "3 years ago, I was trapped in a boarding house fire. While people were filming, one woman ran in. That was Serena Miles. She didn't ask anything, didn't hesitate. I still remember the smoke, the sound of a barking dog, and an arm pulling me out without pause. The woman the police are calling a suspect once saved my life." Attached was an old photo, a woman in uniform, arms marked with smoke stains next to a large black dog with singed fur on its shoulder. The post was shared over 50,000 times in 10 hours. The name Serena Miles was no longer a question mark. It became a symbol for those who had done the work without medals, without ever needing to defend themselves. Details about Echo also began to surface, shared by veterans who had served with Serena. On a Special Forces forum, one post read, "Echo served in Lagman, Afghanistan, one of only 3 dogs to survive a 2018 ambush. He carried a custom tag with engraved metal, 'No strike until spoken.' That's not a command, it's a bond of absolute trust between human and dog in a kill zone." Soon after Echo's badge image spread online, a small metal disc, edges worn, but every letter still sharp. Soldiers who'd been in the field confirmed it was issued only to dogs on special missions. Dogs that never attacked the wrong target and knew the line between threat and duty. An internal training report was leaked. One note silenced every reader. Skill protect designated person under live fire. Record saved 3 teammates from wired landmines. Does not react to gunfire unless given a direct handler command. A photo came with it. Echo head lowered beside a plain stone grave. An American flag planted at an angle behind him caught in the wind. Media outlets began changing their tone. Those who once questioned the dog's behavior began asking instead, why was a professionally trained service dog held at gunpoint by domestic officers? They asked if Echo didn't attack and was still labeled a threat, then who was the real danger in that moment? Serena remained silent, but a day later she appeared in front of a major newspaper's headquarters, the same paper that had once run the headline, "Woman and Dog Obstruct Police Work." She didn't say much, she just stood there with Echo beside her. Reporters rushed in, camera flashes going off like a storm. One shouted, "Do you have a response?" Serena looked straight into the lens, her voice calm, each word sharp as a fired round. They were afraid of the dog because it was the only thing there with a conscience. No one cut in after that sentence. No one pushed back. Because Serena's eyes, when she said it, weren't the eyes of someone arguing. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the final ledge between life and death and understood that when conscience becomes so rare, it's feared the problem doesn't lie with the one being targeted. The problem lies with those trembling because they've finally been seen for what they are. After the incident, the newspaper took down its original article and replaced it with a correction. The first line read, "We can no longer describe Serena Miles solely as the handcuffed woman in a viral video. She is a veteran, a rescuer, a K-9 trainer, and a citizen with a completely clean record." On social media, a new hashtag emerged, @NoStrikeUntilSpoken. It was no longer just a phrase for military dogs. It became a reminder. Morality isn't found in shouting or in weapons, but in restraint even when you know you could choose otherwise. One woman wrote, "I used to think bravery meant action, but sometimes it means not acting despite being more than capable." Echo understands that. Serena lives by it, and that's exactly what made them a target. The post included a photo of Serena sitting in a small courtyard, her hand on Echo's neck, both of them facing forward. No soundtrack, no effects, just stillness so quiet it made people pause and reflect. The story of Serena and Echo was no longer about a single case of racial profiling. It became a test of integrity and strength in a society where stillness is often mistaken for weakness, and silence is labeled as surrender. But from Echo's eyes and from Serena's steady voice, people came to realize there are silences that make entire systems stop and look at themselves. The hearing took place on a bleak afternoon, the press room packed with reporters, cameras, and cold white lights beaming straight at the podium. Two men in plain clothes walked in amid the clicks of shutters. Blake Horner led hands in his pockets, his lazy steps and mocking glance drifting over each lens. Greer followed his face loose as if the press conference were nothing more than a game. Though both were under suspension, they wore the same crooked smirks as if the world around them still couldn't touch them. Some reporters turned toward the back row where Serena Miles sat quietly. She wasn't dressed to stand out, nor did she enter like a central figure. She was simply present with Echo lying at her feet, the dog's gaze fixed on the large screen ahead as it slowly transitioned to slowed-down footage. No one spoke when Echo's image appeared on the screen. His face was taut, front leg lifted off the ground, planted between Blake's gun and Serena's restrained body. Blake's face in the footage was clear with every motion, the raised brow, the half-step back, the grip tightening on his weapon. Every eye on the review board locked onto that frame. A white man, a lieutenant colonel, seated at the center, leaned slightly forward, resting his hand on the table. He said nothing, but his fingers tapped softly on the wood enough for Blake to begin glancing sideways as if realizing the gaze in the room no longer tilted in his favor like it had in previous press conferences. A representative from Internal Affairs stood. She read aloud from the professional K-9 conduct guidelines slowly and deliberately. A protective reaction shows no aggressive advance, no threats, no charge, only block and controlled vocal warning. Then she looked directly at Blake and Greer and repeated one question. "Do you see any behavior in this video that exceeds that standard?" Greer gave a weak laugh, but this time no one joined in. Blake folded his arms, avoiding eye contact. The chair signaled for the next clip. Blake pushing Serena's head down, muttering something close to her ear. There was no microphone, but his lips moved clearly. A lip-reading specialist was called to testify. The salt and pepper-haired man pointed at the screen and said firmly, "What he said was, you see, that dog of yours couldn't save you." The room fell silent. Serena didn't turn, didn't nod. But Echo lifted his head, eyes locking on Greer, as if still remembering the breath of the man who had forced his handler to the ground. A young reporter stood and addressed the panel. If a dog reacts by the exact military standard, and a veteran is wrongfully restrained, what exactly is being taught in police departments today? No one answered, but the silence was louder than any response. A few in the crowd began recording that moment, captioning it simply, They can't deny it anymore. The hearing paused for a closed session. Serena still hadn't spoken a word, but Echo stepped forward when the doors opened. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He simply walked slowly, stood in front of Blake, and looked him straight in the eyes. For 2 seconds, Blake stood still, then subtly stepped back half a pace. A small reaction, but the entire room saw it. An old soldier stood up, speaking without a microphone. A dog can tell right from wrong, yet there are people in uniform who can't. No one asked him to sit down. No one contradicted him. And for the first time, it wasn't Serena. It wasn't the footage. It was Echo's gaze that forced the investigators to look again. Not out of fear, but out of shame. An older reporter, his voice low and deliberate, stood in the left row of the press room, holding a mic without needing to raise it for effect. He leaned slightly toward Serena, his eyes not searching for a headline, but for a truth, however cold it might be. They laughed in the clip, but you didn't. Why? The question cut through the silence like a blade. Serena didn't answer right away. She sat upright, eyes on no one, her hand resting on Echo's head as if steadying both their breathing. Several seconds passed before she responded crisp and without the need for explanation. I've heard laughter right before gunfire. A silence swept through the room like a curtain dropping. No camera dared pan toward Blake or Greer, because no lens would catch anything more than a shoulder flinch or a pair of eyes glued to the table. You can't react to a memory that doesn't belong to you. But that room, with just one sentence, understood that not all laughter is harmless. A few people glanced at Echo, still sitting, his eyes locked on the 2 officers. No growling, no resistance, just watching as if the dog understood that right now his silence alone made Blake's seat feel smaller. One member of the hearing committee opened a folder and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed Serena in uniform standing next to a younger Echo. Both were on a dusty training ground, behind them a mock bullet wall and coils of barbed wire. The photo had no date, just a single word italicized in the corner: Kunduz. The man placed the photo on the table and slid it toward Blake. You called that dog a threat, he said slowly, but it once saved 3 American soldiers from a mine following exact protocol with no missed targets. It has never harmed anyone without a command. Maybe what was out of control that day wasn't this animal. Serena said nothing. She didn't need to defend Echo, and she didn't need to justify her own actions. Everything had been recorded, and every question now belonged to those who had once tried to silence her during a baseless search. Someone nearby, almost in a whisper, repeated the phrase that had spread over the past few days: military dogs are trained not to attack, but they know when humans have gone too far. Greer sat frozen, his eyes darting as if searching for an exit through the stairs, peeling away the layers of defense he had worn on every patrol. And Blake, the man who once spat insults at Serena outside the store, now sat motionless, sweat soaking the back of his shirt. A different reporter this time, a woman, spoke up. If there hadn't been video that day, what do you think would have happened? Serena turned to her, answering slowly. I had already prepared my statement for the military court in case Echo was shot. We're all taught how to write reports before we even know if we'll survive. The words weren't aimed at anyone in particular, but the entire room understood there are battlefields where soldiers are only allowed to grit their teeth and sometimes face a bullet wrapped in a certificate of law. Echo glanced briefly at his handler, then returned to his previous stare. A direct look without hesitation, without fear. And that gaze, more than any defense, more than any statement, was what finally made those who had once mocked him look down in silence. Greer stood up during the hearing, raising his left hand high as living proof, his voice hardening as he said, I was bitten by the dog. This is an injury sustained in the line of duty while trying to control the situation. The statement was picked up instantly by reporters. Some in the room whispered, a few cameras clicked faster, but Serena's eyes didn't leave his hand. Calmly, she reached into her bag and pulled out an X-ray film, handed it to the attorney beside her, then turned to the panel. "I'm submitting counter evidence," she said. "That injury is old recorded in a bar fight report from last year. There's camera footage. He was punched after starting a fight with a customer. It has nothing to do with my dog." Greer's face went pale for a beat. Blake, sitting next to him, leaned in to whisper something, then faced forward, trying to maintain composure. But the composure quickly turned into aggression. Blake spoke through gritted teeth, eyes not on Serena, but aimed at every camera in the room. "She trained that dog to attack police. That's what it's for. That dog reacts on cue. Every time it sees a uniform, it growls." The accusation came out like a barricade, as if, failing logic, he could at least plant doubt. But what Blake hadn't calculated was how the silence that followed would stretch too long. No one agreed. No one laughed. Because they'd all seen the footage, the dog only growled when its handler was cuffed, only moved when the woman was forced face down onto the car, and only stood still once it was told. Serena didn't respond. She simply moved her hand lightly, brushing Echo's neck, a brief signal that they were still holding their ground. A panel member, a former K-9 unit officer who served in Iraq, spoke from the end of the table. "There are 3 levels of response in working dogs: alert, protect, and attack. We've reviewed the video. The dog only alerted. It didn't leap, didn't bite, didn't move more than half a step toward anyone." He paused, turned to Serena, and asked, "When was the last time you ordered it to attack?" Serena replied short and clear, "Afghanistan 2018. A base was rigged. Echo was ordered to strike when scouts were ambushed." No one said anything more. Blake pressed his lips together while Greer turned toward the corner of the room, his gaze avoiding everyone as if trying to take back what he'd just accused. At that moment, Serena's lawyer presented new evidence, a certified health and behavior record for Echo from the military veterinary hospital, clearly stating the dog had caused no active harm in the past 6 years. The document bore signatures from 2 supervising officers in special operations. The panel accepted it and nodded no debate. And those dominant nods, more than any outburst, were what made the 2 officers face what they could no longer dodge, that they were now the ones being watched, evaluated, and held to account. A young reporter standing in the back row raised a hand for permission. If they already knew Echo was a trained military dog, why insist on calling him a threat? The question wasn't answered, just left hanging in the air. But in Serena's eyes there seemed to be the flicker of a smile, not because of victory, but because the truth had stood up for itself through the very wound they tried to forge into evidence. A bite that never existed had become a stain not on skin, but on the conscience of those used to bending facts to their will. Footage from multiple angles, including a clip from a bystander's dash cam, played on the large screen in the center of the hearing room. In every sharp frame, Echo never once left the leash, even as his body braced in front of Serena, even as he growled reflexively, but never showed any behavior beyond control. An independent K-9 behavior expert, unaffiliated with the military or local police, had been invited to the session and delivered his conclusion in an impartial tone. "I've studied every movement carefully. This dog did not act beyond threshold. He was protecting, and he was doing it within the training protocol." He turned to Blake and Greer, his gaze not sharp but strong enough to make the 2 men avert their eyes. "If your dog handlers watched this footage, they'd be ashamed of how little you understand about a loyal, disciplined creature like this." The mood in the room shifted entirely. If at first people had come to hear answers about an alleged overreaction by someone with a weapon, now the focus had swung to the opposite side. There was no doubt left. Echo had never broken from his leash, and Serena had never given a command to attack. But something deeper and more serious had started to surface, details about the coincidentally found plastic bag. Baseless accusations of terrorism, and now a fabricated injury, all like stones laid down to form a neatly constructed narrative, aiming to convince the public that she was a threat. A story crafted and repeated just enough to make some people believe it was true, until Serena's silence became the first crack in its foundation. A longtime female city council member adjusted her microphone and spoke in a voice not loud but very clear. "We are calling for an independent investigation into possible evidence fabrication, scene manipulation, and abuse of authority by officers Blake Horner and Jules Greer." No one interrupted, no one objected. The approval came through the eyes of every person in the room, from reporters to those behind the media barricade. The investigation was no longer optional. It was the bare minimum in response to what had been laid bare on screen: tampered evidence, groundless accusations, and a consistent refusal to engage in honest conversation. An internal police department bulletin was leaked on a midweek morning just as debates on social media had started to quiet down to make room for other news. But its content was powerful enough to pull everyone's attention back. The drug bag that had once been the center of the case was fully exposed. According to the internal affairs investigation, the supposed evidence was actually a prop used during K-9 reaction training exercises, fully cataloged and signed out the day before by Greer himself. The department's storage room had surveillance, and in the footage, Greer could be seen quietly opening the cabinet, pulling out the training bag and slipping it into his pocket before heading to the car with Blake. What had started as a staged intimidation tactic had now crossed into criminal territory. A press statement was released at that exact moment. No press conference, no appearance on camera. Serena issued just one line bolded: "I don't need to win. I just need the truth to come out." That message spread faster than any online argument. It didn't ask for sympathy or force anyone to take side. But readers understood this was no longer just about a woman being harassed or a dog protecting its handler. It was about a mask starting to crack, a mask worn by those used to reshaping truth with authority and convinced they could mold reality to their advantage. As the evidence came to light, the disciplinary board held a closed-door meeting. Violations of professional conduct were listed: tampering with evidence, misusing training materials, submitting false reports, and most seriously abusing power in a non-lethal situation. These offenses didn't just put Greer and Blake at risk of termination, they opened the door to possible criminal charges. But what shook the department wasn't the severity of the violations. It was Serena's composure, her refusal to sue, to retaliate, to demand justice for herself. She let everything unfold as if she had always known this moment would come. At the same time, media coverage shifted tone. A newspaper that once titled its article "The Woman and the Dog Who Caused Chaos" rewrote the story as "Abuse of power doesn't shout. It organizes in silence." A primetime news analyst commented, "She did nothing," and that's what scared them the most. Someone who didn't have to prove anything but still caused everything to unravel. That line was shared thousands of times, a counterpoint to a common pattern where the victim must scream to be believed, and the wrongdoer only has to stay quiet to survive the scandal. Echo continued to accompany Serena at later appointments, but no longer needed to growl. The nods from the investigation board, the stillness of the press, and the avoidance in the eyes of the two officers under review were proof that the truth doesn't need to be amplified to be heard. It just needs to be repeated long enough, clearly enough, and without flinching, just as Serena had allowed it all to unfold without once defending herself. In that battle, she wasn't the one who claimed victory. She was the reason others were forced to drop their masks. Echo entered the testing room under the watchful eyes of over 10 supervisors, including representatives from the disciplinary division, an independent K-9 training expert, police department attorneys, and 3 broadcast cameras live streaming the verification session. Serena held the leash, gave no commands, and only touched Echo's shoulder lightly as a starting cue. The first test was for reaction control under sudden stimuli: sirens, simulated gunfire, and an unfamiliar person approaching from behind. Echo didn't move, held position, didn't turn his head, his eyes fixed on Serena waiting for instruction. Next was a mock assault scenario. A trainer in full protective gear rushed forward with a blunt object. Echo responded exactly as trained, blocking the attacker's knee pinning close, and upon hearing release immediately let go, stepped back 3 paces and sat in a defensive stance. No wasted movement, no excessive reaction. After each test, Echo scored perfectly, and that precision thickened the silence in the room. In a previous report, Blake had claimed Echo was uncontrollable, prone to violent reaction without clear cause. But now, every step, every glance from Echo had purpose, and all of it reflected a level of training only achievable through thousands of hours in the field. After the main evaluation, Echo stayed on for simulated crowd scenario. Police proposed 5 chaotic cases, the kind even officers who had failed 3 times couldn't handle. Echo completed each one flawlessly. By the end, before the panel even announced the results, one member muttered, "This dog processes faster than most people." During the same broadcast, a well-known human rights attorney joined a live interview. He looked directly into the camera and spoke without softening the blow. If a dog can distinguish a real threat and someone with a badge reaches for a gun when it's not needed, then we need to ask who really deserves the badge. The clip was pulled, turned into a meme, and shared as commentary in hundreds of discussions. But what silenced the audience wasn't the irony. It was the truth. A truth so clear it needed no debate. Amid all the arguments about procedure, job stress, and split-second decisions, Echo, a creature without words, had behaved more ethically than the 2 men who once laughed at him. Serena didn't say a word throughout the entire session. She stood in the back, one hand resting lightly on Echo's back out of habit. The same people who once called her a disturber or a suspect now looked at her as a standard of unshakable silence. Not because she proved she was right, but because she never tried to prove anything. She let Echo do that. And the dog, as if he understood his role, did what humans often lose the ability to do, hold his ground without needing to explain. When the evaluation ended, Echo turned back and automatically sat beside Serena, eyes avoiding everyone as if fully aware he was the topic of discussion but saw no one worthy of a response. And Serena, for the first time since the incident began, leaned down slightly and whispered just loud enough to hear, "You did good, soldier." No one knew whether she was speaking to the dog or to herself, but everyone understood a battle had ended, and the one who won was the only being who had never lied. The police headquarters wasn't crowded that morning, but Serena's footsteps echoed clearly down the cold stone hallway. Echo walked beside her, silent, no leash, tugging needed. Serena said nothing, didn't glance at anyone, though every eye from the receptionist to the officers at the door was locked on her and the dog, marked by its military past. She'd been invited to speak before the internal disciplinary board, but the invitation meant more than procedure. It was an assessment of ethics, a final signal that the system was scrambling to salvage some dignity after a series of indefensible failures. Echo stopped at the meeting room door and sat beside a glass wall marked with the slogan, "Protect and Serve." The silver letters reflected in his eyes just below a plaque listing the names of officers lost in the line of duty. A passerby, a new trainee, paused for a moment, took out his phone and snapped a picture. He didn't think much, just posted it with a simple caption. He does it better than most. Within hours, the image spread across law enforcement forums, not because it was beautiful, but because it was too true to argue with. Inside the room, Serena was seated across from 3 people, each representing a division: internal affairs, legal, and communications. No one asked why she brought the dog. No one dared say the word threat. Instead, they opened with a soft phrase, "Thank you for coming." Serena nodded. One of them laid out reports, dash cam footage, witness interviews, and Greer's statement. Echo didn't look at anyone, just lay still under the chair, his head resting on Serena's foot. She didn't interrupt when the legal rep read from the transcripts of the initial encounter. Didn't flinch when the investigator asked, "Do you think you handled the situation provocatively?" Serena answered once evenly, "I didn't respond emotionally. I responded to the threat." The man nodded, then played the clip of Echo stepping between the gun and Serena's body, standing still on command. "Your dog, how does he react with such precision?" Serena looked down. "Because he was trained to do the right thing without waiting for permission." After the exchange, she left the room with nothing in hand, leaving behind only a silence heavy enough to make everyone inside glance back at the reports on the table. Outside, a few people waited, including a retired female officer. She said nothing, just gave a military-style salute, and Echo, understanding, lifted a paw slightly in an old reflex, then turned back to Serena. That look froze the group nearby, not out of fear, but because they knew that from now on they couldn't say we were just following procedure so easily anymore. Because in the middle of that so-called system stood a creature who couldn't speak but knew exactly where the line was between defense and aggression. And while no one yet had the courage to apologize or admit fault, Echo just sat there, eyes locked on the words, "Protect and serve," as if to remind them to keep your honor. You have to deserve it. Blake entered from the right hallway, the fluorescent ceiling lights reflecting off his uniform badge still attached. He scoffed when he saw Serena and Echo standing near the exit. "What is this, a show? Bringing your dog to win public sympathy?" His voice dragged deliberately loud so those in the hearing room could hear. Serena didn't answer, didn't show anger or disdain. She looked at Echo and said softly, "Heel." Echo immediately stood, leaving his spot beside the declaration wall. He turned, moved to Serena's side, walking in sync, as if withdrawn from the battlefield. No sound, no resistance, no growl. Just a quiet act of retreat with dignity. But that calmness thickened the air in the room. A few young officers paused mid-sip of coffee. The internal investigator started to speak but fell silent. They realized not every comment warrants a reply. Sometimes silence follows witnessing something beyond their ability to justify. Echo walked close to Serena, back straight, ears tucked just enough to signal alertness without aggression. Blake stood there, chin tilted upward, as if unaware he'd just been sidelined. His entrance, meant to provoke confrontation, only highlighted the contrast between someone with self-respect and someone using privilege to toss out empty words. And Serena, her eyes steady and unflinching, exited the space that once tried to trap her with the wrong questions. She didn't need to prove anything more, didn't need to clarify rank or badge. By then, everyone understood that in a room built to interrogate the only one who kept their dignity was the person who chose to walk out. The door closed behind them, leaving a long hallway where the rubber pads on Echo's paws were the only sound. But what lingered wasn't the noise. It was the awkwardness that blanketed the air left behind. Silence, once an empty space, had become something with weight. Heavier than judgmental looks, deeper than questions left unasked. In those few seconds, everyone in the room had to confront themselves, had to reevaluate every reaction they'd had over the past few days. When they chose to trust a gun, a title, or words fit for a report, instead of a simple action standing still to protect. And that wordless exit was the final indictment, needing no signature, no witnesses, but undeniable all the same. One day, after Serena and Echo left the interrogation room, the press received a leaked copy of a short text exchange from within the police department. It was a brief back and forth between Blake and Greer. Just toss the bag in the car, who's gonna check? The message wasn't long, and it didn't need explanation. It was enough to expose the entire fabricated setup from the stop, the trunk check to the planted evidence. The wording was crude, clipped like an execution order in a cheap cheap stage play where the actors wore real uniforms but fake morality not even bothering with long dialogue. Social media didn't wait for the evening news. People clipped the quote, put it next to the officers' smirking faces at the press conference, and this time no one laughed back. At the same time, the state prosecutor held a public press conference announcing formal criminal charges against Blake and Greer for evidence tampering and abuse of power. His voice was calm but firm, reading each statute like peeling back layers of corrupted authority. Behind him, a sign read, "Rule of Law," not "Rule of Uniform." The journalists didn't gasp, didn't clap. They just wrote, filmed, and took photos because everyone knew the most crucial moment in any misconduct isn't when it starts, but when it can no longer be hidden behind an internal memo. Blake and Greer didn't show up at the press conference. They didn't respond to requests for comment. Their lawyer requested a delay in the statement, citing online threats against the clients, but no one needed to threaten them. The evidence no longer sat in a crumpled plastic bag. It was in the chat logs, in surveillance footage, in the unmistakable, untrainable expression of a loyal dog. Echo couldn't speak, but the way he stood between Serena and the gun, the way he never crossed the leash line even under threat, and the moment he stared straight into the camera as if knowing who was judging him, those were proofs no one could fabricate. A legal analyst said on TV, "The irony is that the ones who lied were exposed by the thing they thought easiest to control a dog." But Echo was never a tool, never trained for blind aggression. He was forged on the battlefield in the space between life and death where one wrong move could cost a whole unit. And yet the ones who wore the title law enforcement thought they could deceive him and through him deceive the system. The prosecutor's office suddenly became a place where people lined up to hand-deliver thank you letters for calling things by their rightful name. An elderly woman brought a photo of her son who died in combat along with his medal. "Give it to Echo. He deserves to wear it for my boy." And among thousands of messages, posts, and hashtags, what lingered wasn't outrage, but a steady sense of hope that there's still a limit to power, that some things can't be faked, and when truth is touched by a paw with claws, honor stops being abstract. It becomes something that must be returned through a full and public legal reckoning. The city police chief stepped up to the press conference podium, holding a prepared speech but not once looking down at it. In the front row, Serena sat silently, Echo lying beside her chair, head held high, ears alert. The air was tight, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. The head of the city's law enforcement, the same man who stayed silent when the first video spread, who once cited internal procedures to dodge comment, now took a long breath and bowed his head to her. His voice was low and dry, allowed the wrong man to act against the right one. The words weren't dramatic nor hurried, but they carried straight to the far edge of the room like a bell struck square against the heart of everyone watching. Cameras flashed in quick bursts and reporters sat frozen as if compressed into a single moment where no one dared interrupt. Serena didn't move. She sat upright, eyes forward, not nodding, not smiling. Only Echo, after that long silence, gently licked her hand once, a response carrying both agreement and vigilance. A reporter quietly whispered into their mic, a loyal reflex, but only to the right person. Behind that apology, there was no soundtrack, no applause. Everyone present understood it wasn't a gesture of reconciliation, and it wasn't meant to appease the media. It was a necessary act, one that should have come days ago when a veteran was cornered between two guns and a pair of cuffs. The chief continued, "We will be reforming our procedures for assessing and controlling on-the-ground authority. But first, I offer a direct apology to Ms. Serena Miles, not because she served in the military, but because she was betrayed by the very people meant to protect her." Each sentence landed like a small cut into the polished armor the system had tried to keep intact. No one stood. No one disrupted the steady rhythm of breath inside the room. And somehow, that silence gave the press conference more weight than any criminal sentence ever handed down. Outside, the city City Hall, the crowd was large but orderly. Many held handwritten signs, not loud slogans, just messages like, "A dog protected us from corrupted authority," and Echo held the guard post the law should have stood at. Someone placed a water bowl at the foot of the honor guard statue next to a bag of dog food with a note inside for the only soldier who didn't retreat. Social media was filled with images of Echo licking Serena's hand and her expression as she looked up at the head of the department, cold, steady, but not hateful. It was the look of someone who didn't need to win to prove anything, only needed justice to return to where it had always belonged. In a corner of the headquarters courtyard, someone had hung a small sign. "We can't undo a missed moment, but we can keep it from happening to the next person." And somehow, that was exactly what Serena chose to hold on to. Not reputation, not compensation, but the boundary. The boundary between right and wrong, between loyalty and blindness, between protecting a community or just protecting the right to wear a uniform. Echo didn't know the law, but he understood that what Serena had just done mattered because he hadn't left her side for even a second since the apology was spoken. Serena walked out of the hearing room with the compensation offer already on the table, an estimated multi-million-dollar sum accompanied by a thick file prepared by a legal team. Some viewed it as the inevitable next step, an attempt to repair damage that could be measured in dollars. But she didn't open the file, didn't sign, didn't set any terms. She simply answered the press circling around her. "I decline." The first reporter immediately asked why voice sharper than usual. "You know, you could win. Why pass up the chance to prove the system should pay the price?" Serena looked up at him, her eyes calm, her reply quiet but heavy as it landed in the middle of a crowded room. "Justice isn't money. It's something no one can reclaim once it's lost honor." The statement wasn't met with applause or turned into slogans, but it stayed with many afterward people who once believed justice could be measured in compensation. Refusing didn't mean forgetting. Serena didn't let herself become a victim of a payout. She didn't leave the city, didn't relocate, didn't appear on talk shows. She still visited her usual store, walked Echo every morning, and placed a hand on his head whenever someone whispered behind her. She did nothing to stand out, but it was that exact stillness that made people watch. She held true to what she had said from the start. "I don't need to win, I just need the truth to come out." The story was no longer about a clash between citizen and police or even a legal victory. It became a test of the system, and people began to ask themselves how many times before there had been no Echo, no camera, no one like Serena standing still, and how many truths had slipped past the line before anyone could catch them. One week after she turned down the settlement, a group of law students wrote to thank her for preserving the definition of honor they once thought only existed in textbooks. They didn't call her a hero. They simply wrote, "Thank you for holding on to something we're not sure we'd have kept if it had been us." It was the simplest, most profound thank you Serena had ever received. She read the letter in silence, then handed Echo a training biscuit just like she always did when a test ended exactly as it should. No whistle, no excessive praise, just a shared look between two beings who had crossed a line many assumed couldn't be crossed. Greer and Blake, after the hearing, were permanently barred from working in law enforcement. But Serena didn't care about their sentences. She once said in a private conversation with a veterans group representative, "I don't need to see them fall. I need to see the system forced to change so they never get another chance to repeat it." The silence that followed her words echoed the same way her commands to Echo always had, brief, exact, final, and needing no repetition. Echo remained the anchor between two worlds, military and civilian life, loyalty and control, reaction and restraint. But it was Serena who kept him balanced on that line, neither retreating nor stepping beyond the boundary. Honor, as she said, is something that can't be reclaimed once surrendered. And this time, it wasn't taken away. Not because of the law, but because of the choice made by the one once tasked with protecting it at any cost. Echo stood center stage during the recognition ceremony, ears perked in alert instinct, but his eyes softened when he spotted Serena sitting in the back row. The dog didn't understand the viral clips or the flood of praise, but he responded to the one thing that can't be fake: respect. The event, hosted by the city council, was originally meant to honor Serena, but she declined the spotlight. She told the organizers simply, honor is knowing who deserves to tell the story, not who's invited. She gave the place to a teenager, a high school student who had been there that day, standing in the crowd filming Frozen as he watched a dog step between a gun and its owner. He walked up to the stage, holding a note in shaky hands, voice still nervous, but gaze steady. I'm not here to talk about the law. I'm here to talk about what I saw and never forgot. He recounted the moment everyone had seen in the video, but this time not through a lens or edited clip, but from the heartbeat of someone young who had just realized what restraint truly meant. He didn't praise Echo as a hero, nor did he frame Serena as a symbol. He just said he was about to walk away when the police approached, thinking, this will end like everything else, with a late apology or a death someone finds a way to excuse. But he stayed, not because of hope, but because a dog didn't move. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't back off. He stayed because he knew he was keeping someone safe. And in that moment, I saw what we're always waiting for from adults: clarity in response, not in words. The entire hall fell silent. Serena lowered her head gently, touching the medal just awarded to Echo, but she didn't fasten it around his neck. She tucked it into her coat pocket, because to her, Echo didn't need a decoration. He had done what he was trained to do. The rest is up to us. After the speech, there was no loud applause. People stood up like a reflex, needing no signal. No one talked about being moved or called it a beautiful ending, because those who had followed the story from the beginning knew it wasn't beautiful, just right. A black woman who didn't lash out a dog that didn't need protecting, a teenager who didn't run from an ugly scene, and those three choices together made up a measured act in the middle of chaos. After the ceremony, Serena didn't give interviews. She led Echo off the stage, like ending a training session without theatrics, without trying to leave a mark. But the photo that went viral that day wasn't of the ceremony. It was the moment the teenager stepped down from the stage, bowed his head, and gently ran his hand over Echo's head before returning to his seat. A hand not yet old enough to vote, touching a kind of honor an entire system once tried to reject, and this time no one dared dismiss it as a coincidence. Because when a measured act is repeated across generations, it stops being instinct, it becomes the standard. The story of Serena and Echo did not end after the commendation ceremony, but quietly opened another chapter in how society perceives control, response, and what constitutes propriety. When the glow of the ceremony faded, when the applause remained only in the memories of a few who had been present, the echo of the event still slipped into everyday conversations, from the small corner cafe to the closed meeting rooms of law enforcement agencies. Police academies across the country began updating their curriculum, incorporating the Serena Echo case as an official reference scenario in the correct response in military dog control training course. They used it not only to teach officers how to assess situations, but also to emphasize a truth many find hard to accept. Not every correct response comes from a human being. In an old lecture hall, yellow light from fluorescent bulbs fell onto rows of worn wooden desks as a veteran instructor, silver hair mingling with a seasoned voice, stood before the class, looked directly at the young cadets, and spoke slowly. There are moments when doing nothing is the most accurate response, and sometimes the only creature in the entire frame who knows that is the dog. The class remained silent. On the large screen, a photograph of Echo standing between the gun and Serena was enlarged to every detail, from the tense light in its eyes to the raised hairs along its neck. No caption, no no explanation. The gaze alone was enough. At the same time, a group of former service members from several states launched a campaign called Hold the Leash. At first, the name made many think it was a slogan for control or a military order, but once they heard the explanation, its true meaning became clear. It was not to praise Echo as a symbol of blind loyalty, but to highlight the role of steadiness of actions free from impulse in an era where everything is pushed to extremes just to provoke an immediate reaction. The founders of the campaign understood that the world now moves at the pace of social media, where quick responses are often celebrated more than correct ones. They wanted to revive an old value, the ability to wait to hold one's ground when everything around is being swept into chaos. They began by producing a series of podcasts recorded in small rooms with soundproofed walls, microphones placed close enough to capture even the slowing of breath as memories resurfaced. Each episode was a narrative from veterans who had served alongside military dogs, not only in blazing battlefields but also in the gray zones where laws were no longer a priority, and survival depended on instinct. The voices sometimes trembled, sometimes held firm, but always shared one point. Each dog was not merely a tool but a teammate who understood the limits of violence better than many people. One of the most frequently retold stories was Serena's case, not because of the twist that she was a veteran, but because she chose to remain silent throughout the entire sequence of events despite every gaze, every camera, and every pressure demanding that she speak up. In one podcast episode, the host said a line that made listeners rewind to hear it again. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She let the dog do what humans have forgotten to hold its ground, to wait for others to realize on their own who was crossing the line. The Hold the Leash campaign quickly spread not only within the military community but also into educational conferences, legal roundtables, and even journalism classes. They wrote no flashy slogans, built no overblown images. Instead, they used leaked messages and unedited clips, things audiences rarely see, to prove that if Serena had reacted like most people, shouting, yanking, or counterattacking, she might have been steered by prejudice and by the setup of those waiting for a mistake to twist the story elsewhere. But her choice to stay silent, to keep Echo from attacking, to keep her own hand from pulling the leash hard, made her the only person who maintained control of the setting while everything around was unraveling. A high school in Michigan even introduced a civics discussion titled "Who Really Controlled the Situation?" The teacher imposed no answer, leaving students to debate freely. In the end, most concluded that Echo was not trained to retaliate in every situation, but to recognize limits, and that was precisely what made it an irreplaceable image in the collective memory. Serena, true to her nature from the start, did not join the campaign and gave no further interviews. She withdrew to a small suburban home where a few old apple trees grew in the backyard and autumn leaves scattered across the wooden steps each afternoon. For many months, she was known only through a brief email to the campaign founders I hold the leash not to control it, but to remind myself that if there's anything worth holding tightly, it should be resolve, not power. That reply, simple yet sharp as a blade cutting through the illusions of the era, became the opening line of a small book the campaign published. On the cover was a photo of Echo sleeping at Serena's feet, the leash still loose, its head resting on a worn, faded military boot. A silence unpretentious, yet large enough to become the most powerful voice in an age of noise. The day of the final verdict arrived. The city courthouse, a gray stone building from the early century, was packed. Greer and Blake appeared without the smugness or flippant defenses they had shown before. Their suits were neat, but could not hide the fatigue or their avoiding eyes. Both were sentenced to 18 months of suspended prison time along with a permanent revocation of their service credentials after a series of evidence revealed systematic fabrication, slander, and abuse of power. As the judge read the verdict, the room was so still that the sound of paper paper turnin' was clear. No one applauded, no one cheered for victory. Justice here did not need to be loud because those in the room understood that noise was often just a way to hide emptiness. On the way out of the courthouse, Greer pulled his jacket up to cover his face, and Blake kept his head down, no longer wearing the crooked smile that had appeared in earlier press briefings. No one looked back at Serena, and no one spoke an apology. They walked quickly, their steps urgent, as if trying to escape a place where even their own shadows would not dare follow. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sky was clear, but the wind cut cold against the skin. Echo stood at the foot of the old stone steps, right beside Serena. It did not bark, did not move, only stood there silent like a monument made of flesh and bone. People gathered in a quiet circle around the two figures, one human, one dog. No one speaking to break the stillness. Cameras from multiple news outlets were raised flashes, bursting like artificial lightning, but no light drew Echo's gaze away. It looked straight into the lens, its eyes the same as on the first day alert. Calm, unflinching, as if it understood that this moment no longer belonged to humans, but was a moment that needed a witness, and it accepted that role with the full dignity of a silent warrior. An older journalist, hair streaked with silver, long accustomed to scenes of blood and tears in his career, suddenly lowered his camera. He spoke softly, just loud enough for the person beside him to hear, "I've never seen a dog's eyes make people feel they should live better like that." The whisper never made it into the news, but it followed those who heard it all the way home like an unwritten command. Serena did not speak. She simply stood beside Echo, her hand resting lightly on its back, a gesture like giving thanks without word. All the stories about honor, about truth, about the limits of power rose on their own in the minds of those present. Not because of a fiery speech, not because of a sharp sentence from the court, but because there was a creature unable to lie, unable to shift blame, that had stood there from beginning to end, never changing its place. A teacher among the group of students visiting the trial whispered to a colleague, "Maybe today's moral lesson will be easier to teach than I thought." When Serena and Echo stepped down from the stone steps, the crowd that had been pressing close automatically parted to both sides. No one ordered it, not from fear, but as an unconscious reflex for something higher than rank law or public opinion, that was respect. Serena's boots struck the stone in a steady rhythm. Echo walking close at her side, the leash still loose, its head facing forward, never once looking back. A child in the crowd turned to his mother and asked quietly, "What's that dog's name?" The mother did not answer right away, her eyes still following their fading silhouettes at the end of the steps. Then she spoke softly, almost a whisper echo. "It doesn't need to speak, but it makes people listen." That answer was not carried off by the wind. It became what lingered in the lenses in the articles afterward and in the memory of those who once believed that everything had to be shouted to be true. But Echo's gaze proved the opposite, that the truest thing sometimes is the one no one dares to look at for long, and that day it looked straight at everyone. The story of Serena and Echo did not end after the commendation ceremony, but quietly opened another chapter in how society views control response and what defines propriety. When the glow of the ceremony faded, when the applause lingered only in the memories of the few who had been there, the resonance of the event still found its way into everyday conversations. In small corner cafes, people spoke of it between work updates and the weather. In closed meeting rooms of law enforcement agencies, it was mentioned with caution, both as an example and as a warning. Police academies across the country began updating their training materials, adding the Serena Echo incident as an official reference scenario in the correct response in military dog control course. It was used not only to teach officers how to assess situations, but also to stress a truth many find difficult to accept. Not every correct response comes from a human being. In an old lecture hall, Pale yellow light from fluorescent bulbs fell across rows of worn wooden desks marked by decades of students. A veteran instructor, his hair, now more silver than black, stood upright, hands clasped behind his back, voice steady and deep-looking, straight at the young cadets. There are times when doing nothing is the most accurate response, and sometimes the only creature in the entire frame who knows that is the dog. The words fell into stillness. No chair scraped, no page turned. On the large screen behind him, the photograph of Echo standing between the gun and Serena was enlarged to every detail, the tense light in its eyes, its straight spine, the raised hairs along its neck. No caption, no introduction. Its gaze alone was enough. At the same time, a group of former service members from different states launched a campaign called Hold the Leash. At first, the name led many to think of a command for control or a military slogan. But once they heard the explanation, the real meaning became immediately clear. It was not to praise Echo as a symbol of blind loyalty, but to emphasize the role of steadiness of actions, free from impulse in an era where everything is pushed to extremes just to provoke instant reaction. The founders, most of whom had served in places where the sound of gunfire was part of the background, understood that the modern world lives at the speed of social media, where fast responses are rewarded more than correct ones. They wanted to remind people of an old but enduring value, knowing how to wait, knowing how to hold one's position when everything around is spinning. They began with a series of podcasts recorded in narrow rooms with soundproofed walls under soft yellow lights, microphones placed close to capture every hesitant breath. Each episode was a first-person account from veterans who had served with military dogs, not only in blazing battlefields but also in gray zones where laws were no longer a priority, and survival depended on instinct. The voices sometimes trembled, sometimes were steady, but always shared one truth: each dog was not just a tool, but a teammate, and sometimes they understood the limits of violence better than humans. One of the most frequently retold stories was Serena's case, not because of the late revelation that she was a veteran, but because she chose to remain silent throughout the entire chain of events, despite pressure and the piercing eyes fixed on her. In one episode, the host spoke slowly, as if letting each word sink deeply into the listener's ear. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She let the dog do what humans have forgotten: hold its ground, wait for people to realize on their own who was crossing the line. The Hold the Leash campaign spread quickly from the military community to education, law, and journalism circles. They released no bright posters, built no overblown images. Instead, they published leaked text messages and unedited footage, things rarely seen by the public, to show that if Serena had reacted like most people, shouting, yanking the leash, or counterattacking, she could easily have been swept into a storm of prejudice and manipulation. It was her choice to remain silent, to keep Echo from attacking, to keep her own hand from tightening the leash that made her the only person who maintained control in the midst of a spiraling loss of control. A high school in Michigan even included in its civics class the topic, "Who really controlled the situation?" Students were free to debate, and most concluded that Echo was not trained to retaliate unconditionally, but to recognize limits, and that was precisely what made its image impossible to replace in the shared memory. Serena, true to her reserved nature, did not join the campaign and gave no interviews. She withdrew to a small suburban home where a few old apple trees grew in the backyard, and each autumn afternoon the wind scattered yellow leaves across the wooden steps. For many months, she was known only through a short email to the campaign founders. "I hold the leash not to control it, but to remind myself that if there is anything worth holding tightly, it should be resolve, not power. The words, simple yet sharp as a blade, became the opening line of a small book the campaign published. On its cover was a photo of Echo sleeping at Serena's feet, the leash loose, its head resting on a worn, faded military boot. A silence, unpretentious, yet weighty enough to stand as a declaration. Then, the day of the final verdict arrived. The city courthouse, a gray stone building from the early century, with wide steps and heavy wooden doors, was packed. Grier and Blake appeared without the smugness or mocking smiles once seen. Their crisp suits could not hide their fatigue. Both were sentenced to 18 months of suspended prison time and permanently stripped of their service credentials after the court revealed evidence of systematic fabrication, slander, and abuse of power. As the judge read the verdict, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, the sound of paper turning ringing sharp and clear. No one applauded, no one cheered. Justice that day needed no noise. On the way out of the courthouse, Grier pulled his collar high, covering most of his face. Blake kept his head down, avoiding every glance. No one looked back at Serena, and no apology was given. They walked quickly, as if wanting to escape a place where even their own shadows did not want to follow. Outside, the autumn sky was clear, but the wind was sharp and cold. Echo stood at the stone steps right beside Serena. It did not bark, did not move, only stood straight like a monument of flesh and bone. The circle of people around them was silent, no one breaking the stillness. Camera flashes went off in quick succession, but the light did not make Echo blink. It looked straight into the lens, its eyes, the same as on the first day, alert, calm, unyielding, as if it understood that this moment no longer belonged to humans but to a witness, and it accepted that role with the full dignity of a silent warrior. An older journalist, hair silvered, who had seen enough pain from war and injustice, lowered his camera without thinking and murmured to a colleague, "I've never seen a dog's eyes make people feel they should live better like that." The whisper did not appear in any report, but it would follow those present that day for years to come. Serena still said nothing. She placed her hand lightly on Echo's back, a gesture like a thank you without sound. All the stories about honor, truth, and the limits of power rose unbidden in the minds of those who watched. Not because of a speech, not because of the verdict, but because there was a creature unable to lie, unable to shift blame, that had stood there from start to finish without moving. A teacher in the group of students attending the trial leaned over and whispered, "Maybe today's moral lesson will be easier to teach than I thought." When Serena and Echo stepped down from the stone steps, the crowd parted to both sides on its own, not from an order, not from fear, but as a reflex for something higher than rank or law, that was respect. Serena's footsteps struck the stone in a steady rhythm. Echo walking beside her, the leash still loose. A child tugged at his mother's hand and asked cautiously, "What's that dog's name?" The mother stayed silent for a moment, watching their figures fade, then answered quietly, "Echo. It doesn't need to speak, but it makes people listen." That answer did not drift away on the wind, but anchored itself in the memories of those who once thought truth had to be shouted. Echo's gaze proved the opposite, that the truest thing sometimes is the one no one dares to look at for long, and that day it looked straight at everyone. The commendation ceremony was held in the auditorium of the National Canine Organization, where dogs that had saved lives from bombs, terrorism, and natural disasters were named as silent heroes. Echo walked up onto the wooden stage without needing to be led. Only Serena beside it, the leash held loosely in her hand. It stood at attention as if answering a roll call to an invisible command, its gaze sweeping the crowd before stopping on its handler's face, waiting. The host introduced, "This is the first dog to be honored not for an act of attack, but for the ability to refuse to attack even when it could." The whole auditorium applauded, but Serena did not smile. She bent down, pressing her forehead lightly to Echo's head, a way of saying thank you without words. A young journalist raised a hand during the Q&A, eyes both curious and respectful. Can another dog be trained like Echo, a dog that knows the boundary between discipline and resistance? The question made the room momentarily still. All eyes turned to the veteran trainer seated in the front row. He had designed the K9 training system for the military and had personally signed off on Echo's completion of the highest level course. The silver-haired man looked up and answered slowly, "Technically, yes. Morally, no. Morality is not a test or a command. It is not something you upload into an animal like software. It reflects the person holding the leash. If that person acts with respect and steadiness, the dog will learn that. If that person chooses violence, the dog will mirror it exactly. Echo is the product of someone who did not teach it to win, but taught it to know when not to win." The room fell silent. The applause that followed was not loud, but steady. It was not meant to glorify, but to acknowledge something hard to face, that a dog's courage is sometimes the only thing left keeping the human part alive among those who carry guns and badges. Another reporter turned toward Serena to ask more, but she only nodded lightly, tightening her hold on the leash before walking away. Echo followed without being tugged, without a command. The two figures left the hall in the pale afternoon light behind them, dozens of eyes still fixed on the wooden stage where the dog had stood. After the ceremony, Echo's image was added to the training curriculum of K9 academies, but what drew more attention was the video clip from the event where the trainer said, "The leash is just an object. What holds the dog is the character of the one who holds it." In many places, newspapers began calling Echo the dog that needed no redemption. Not because it had never been to a combat zone, but because it had never done wrong, so there was nothing that needed to be set right. Analysts studied its nonverbal cues, the way Echo glanced when Serena stayed silent during press conferences, the way it positioned itself between her and police weapons, and the way it stood motionless until given a command. But what haunted people was not its stance, it was its restraint, the instinct driven to the edge of provocation yet held in check by a single word, "stay." And what held that instinct back was not technique, but a relationship built on trust and morality. Echo did not know it was being honored. It did not need to understand politics or discrimination. But through its gaze, people understood something they should have learned long ago, that when no one trusts those in uniform anymore, a loyal dog is the only thing that can make a crowd stay instead of scatter. And Echo, through its composure and precise response in every moment, became the reason an entire system had to look at itself. Not because it was a special dog, but because the person holding the leash chose not to use it to protect herself, but to protect her character. Serena walked slowly beside Echo, passing through the neighborhood where all the upheaval had begun. The street was the same. The sidewalk still slanted, the bushes along the path still left untrimmed. But the air was different. She was no longer the woman pulled to the ground, her arms twisted behind her back, her head forced into the grass. She walked as if she had never been in that situation, as if that humiliation had never been replayed millions of times online. Echo walked close to her leg head, held high, carrying the bearing of a soldier without rank or medals. The two figures, one human, one dog, moved past each house, each path, each place where once there had been sneers or phones raised a record in secret. A child stood behind a window pane unmoving. The mother behind him pulled the curtain aside and watched, then gave a small nod. Across the street, the couple who had once accused Serena of disturbing the neighborhood sat on their porch without speaking. The man stood, lowered his head slightly, not offering an apology, not raising a hand in greeting, but letting his eyes withdraw the power he had once imposed on others by skin color alone. Serena neither glanced at them, nor stopped, nor demanded that anyone redeem themselves in words. She kept walking because that silence was enough. Echo stayed exactly one step behind, sometimes glancing up at its handler before looking forward again. At one point, it stopped staring directly at a man who had once called it a killer dog. The man no longer shouted, no longer hurled insults. He nodded slowly, his eyes dropping as if accepting a verdict that needed no words. Serena remembered each stretch of the road. She remembered the chill in her palms when she was forced down, the click of the handcuffs behind her head, the phones recording while no one stepped forward to help. But today those memories did not surface to make her angry. They came back like a test that had already been completed, its result not graded by her. It was the quiet nods that served as the final seal. No press release needed, no cameras, no lawyers. Sometimes justice is not in the verdict, but in the fact that someone once humiliated can walk side by side with those who did it and not bow their head. At the far corner of the block where Blake had once gripped the handcuffs tight and shouted into her ear, there was now an empty playground. No children were running or playing, but 3 children sat watching through the fence, their eyes following Echo. One of them turned to a friend and whispered, "That's the dog my mom told me about." Another boy quietly asked, "Is she coming back to arrest someone?" The answer came when Echo turned its head, stepped closer to the fence, and stood still looking at the 3 children as if inspecting them. No growl, no bark, no wag of the tail, just a look. And the children did not run. They stayed still until one of them reached a small hand through the gap in the fence. Echo did not move forward, but gave a slight nod. Serena did not intervene. She understood this was the moment the dog said what humans could never convey in words, a second chance not to make amends, but to learn how to live right from the start. She and Echo left that neighborhood as if they had never been driven out of it, as if they were the ones who now possessed what the place had lost honor. No one blocked their way, and no one saw them off. But from second-floor windows, from unswept steps, from faded yards, there were countless eyes watching, not out of fear, but because they knew that this time they had no reason to turn away. Echo did not need to bark. The way it silently looked at each person made the entire neighborhood understand that a dog can be trained to attack, but only courage and morality can train it to know when to stop and to forgive. Serena led Echo onward, as if walking for the first time through the very place that had once defined her life, and this time not to be judged, but to prove something undeniable, that justice, when held by someone who does not need revenge, is what makes those who once spoke with authority bow their heads in silence. In a simple, yet orderly hall with a low ceiling and long fluorescent tubes, white light fell straight onto gray floor tiles polished smooth from constant cleaning. The scent of fresh wall paint still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint smell of paper from the neatly stacked materials on each student's desk. The soft glide of pens on paper blended with the sound of pages turning, all in a steady rhythm familiar to those sitting here. The police cadets sat in rows, backs straight, eyes forward, hands taking notes, trying to capture every word, every point. On the large screen at the front, an image that had spread across the internet for months was shown again, Serena standing beside Echo, her gaze calm, the military dog silent and motionless directly in front of a gun aimed at her. The lighting in the photo was harsh, but the frozen tension in the frame made anyone who stared long enough feel as if they were inside that moment. The title of that day's discussion was projected just below the image, Echo and the Woman Who Did Not Speak, a phrase both controversial and impossible to ignore. The instructor for the session was a retired lieutenant colonel, trim in build, despite being past 60. He stepped to the lectern, his movements slow, but assured, his gaze sweeping across each row. Instead of opening with operational theory or bullet points from the syllabus, he simply asked, "How many people here find this image makes them uncomfortable?" The room's energy shifted. A few hands rose hesitantly, then lowered again when they saw no one else respond. The entire space fell into a silence that could not easily be defined. not the silence of indifference, but of not knowing which side one was on. Then, from the last row, a young cadet spoke. His voice was neither loud nor shaky, carrying no hint of provocation. "How do you know you're abusing power if every action can be justified as following procedure?" All eyes turned to the instructor. He did not answer right away. Instead, he turned to walk to the whiteboard and wrote a single short line: "When someone is silent and you still feel threatened." No one wrote it down. No one asked a follow-up question. They just looked at the sentence as if each was silently applying it to a private memory. Everyone understood that the answer was not in any operations manual or in any lecture on suspect control, but in looking into the eyes of the person being subdued and asking yourself, are they silent because they submit or because they know too well that the system will never listen? That day's discussion ended earlier than usual. The instructor spoke only one sentence before gathering his materials. Police do not have the right to feel insulted when the other side keeps their dignity. The moment the words ended, the hall seemed to thicken. There was no applause, no comment. Everyone rose quietly, packed their things, but the heaviness followed them all the way to the door. In the hallway, groups of students gathered in small clusters. One person opened a phone and replayed the video of Serena walking out of the interrogation room. Without saying a word, she simply gave Echo the command heel. The short order rang out, and the dog immediately moved in close beside her, their steps in perfect sync, as if the two bodies were connected by an invisible line. No matter how many times it was replayed, the footage always slowed the air around it, not because of suspense, but because it showed a kind of power greater than handcuffs or arrest warrants, self-control. One cadet, eyes still fixed on the screen, murmured, "I used to think the uniform made you part of justice, but now I see justice doesn't wear a uniform." No one laughed, no one disagreed. At the end of the hallway, the instructor stood still, hands in his pockets, eyes looking out toward the courtyard. He had served 30 years in the force, once leading rapid response teams into the most dangerous situations, and had seen many young officers celebrated only to lose everything over one wrong decision. But Serena's case reminded him of something that should have been obvious but had been forgotten. Human character cannot be disguised by orders. A uniform can cover scars on the skin, but it cannot hide the cowardice in the eyes. It can grant authority, but it cannot teach morality. In the pocket of his coat was still a copy of an old press release, the edges yellowed with age. It was where Serena had once written, "I don't need to win. I just need the truth to come out." The plain black letters, without ornament or sensationalism, still tightened something in his chest every time he read them, as if there was something too real to ignore. A month later, the school officially added ethical analysis in real-world confrontations to the curriculum. The first lesson was about Serena and Echo. No one called it a case of procedural mishandling anymore. They called it by its name, abuse of power reflected in steadfast silence. From then on, every time they walked into the practical training room, students passed by a photo hanging in the hallway. Echo sitting at the courthouse gates, not barking, just staring directly into the camera. Beneath it were the words, "Silence is not submission. Sometimes it is the final and strongest form of resistance." No one dared joke when walking past it, and no one said, "It's just a dog." In a system that had once used weapons to silence the vulnerable, the image of a woman who did not answer violence with violence and a dog that never broke the leash was enough to make an entire generation of future officers ask themselves who is really in control and who has truly lost it. In the small suburban house, Serena rearranged her bookshelf on a dry morning. Early sunlight streamed through the window, spilling into the room and casting a glow on the single photograph in a dark wooden frame on the top shelf. In the picture, Echo stood firm between two police officers, its face turned not toward the camera but slightly back toward where she she had been standing in the moment the gun was drawn. Since the event, invitations had arrived from everywhere: universities, civil organizations, human rights forums, both international and local. People wanted Serena to speak, to share her views, to analyze the incident, to inspire the new generation. But every letter was stacked neatly, none replied to. She refused them all, not in words, but through prolonged silence, the kind of silence that echoed from the very path she had chosen. Those close to her understood that this refusal was not a rejection of society or responsibility, but her way of protecting the integrity of the act so it would not be turned into a media tool or a model lesson for others to reshape as they pleased. She slowed her life. Each early morning, when the streets were still sparse and the shops unopened, she took Echo for a walk. In the news, her name appeared less and less, but in training classrooms her story was still told as a scenario no manual could provide. Sometimes people curious enough came to her gate leaving notes or standing quietly to look through the fence, but Serena never came out. She was not angry nor afraid. She simply kept the right to choose when to speak or to remain silent, the same way she had once held the leash without tightening it. Old friends from the military occasionally stopped by, leaving a can of drink or a bag of treats for Echo at her door. One of them once said, "What happens on land can be more dangerous than the battlefield." Serena only replied softly, "The battlefield doesn't choose who's right. On land, you have to make that clear." At night, when the house was quiet, she placed her hand on the photo frame. In the picture, Echo still stood there, watchful, steady, not barking. Behind the photo, in the small handwritten letters, was a line among those with guns. There was only one without hatred. No one had taught her that, no one had suggested it. It had simply come like a conclusion that needed no proof. Echo was still alive, still responding precisely to every gesture, still looking straight into a stranger's eyes before deciding between welcome and caution. But after the event it was quieter, more reserved. The two seemed to understand each other through restraint without command. A nod, a glance, a step in sync. Serena had never trained Echo to be a symbol, and that was exactly why it became something no one could replicate. One late afternoon, she paused before the mirror, adjusting her collar. On the chair lay an old uniform she had not worn in a long time. Serena looked at it, then folded it and placed it at the bottom of the wardrobe. She had once walked out of battlefields, lived through explosions, retreat orders, and cries for help. But the first time a gun was aimed at her in her own homeland and by someone wearing a badge was a different experience. She needed no one to credit her, no one to restore her honor, because it had never been lost. It was still there in the way Echo lifted its head at the sound of police boots on the sidewalk, in the eyes of children who saw her pass without stepping aside, and in the single photo she chose to keep as a reminder. Some things are held on to not because of the beauty of the moment, but because the truth in that moment cannot be faked. The veterans gathering was held simply in a small auditorium of a local high school. The hall was not new, but was clean, with beige-painted walls faded at the corners and a low ceiling lined with white fluorescent lights. The light fell onto the gray tile floor, worn along the main walkways, reflecting back in faint streaks. There were no bright banners, no capital letter slogans stretched across the stage, no film crews or clusters of reporters. On stage stood only a long wooden table covered with a plain white cloth, behind it a slightly wrinkled deep blue curtain. Rows of plastic chairs were arranged neatly, and the room was not perfectly soundproof, so the occasional sound of wind slipping through the door gaps could be heard. Students sat shoulder to shoulder, most still in their school uniforms, white shirts, blue trousers, or plaid skirts. On their faces was a mix of curiosity and reserve. No one was noisy, but neither was the room completely silent. Now and then there was a soft murmur, but when the program coordinator stepped to the lectern, everyone quickly focused. Serena sat in the front row to her right, an elderly nurse with silver hair, small in build, but with bright eyes, who had once worked alongside her on the front lines during the war years. Echo lay tucked beneath the chair, its front legs stretched out, head resting on its paws, ears twitching only at unusual sounds. No one needed to tell it. It had always known how to stay still in places like this. The program coordinator, a middle-aged teacher, opened in a gentle tone, introducing Serena in only a few brief lines. Her military service record, a few notable missions, and a recent prominent incident. Everyone knows a phrase spoken slowly enough for all to understand without it being named directly. Serena only nodded in place of a greeting. Her hand rested lightly on Echo's back, not pose or send a message, but as a long-standing habit, a quiet, invisible tether. From the middle rows, a hand went up. It was a thin-built male student voice, shaky but clear. "Were you ever angry when treated that way?" The room fell silent. Some adults lowered their heads, and a few young people looked at her intently, as if waiting for a fiery, indignant, or decisive answer. But Serena simply turned her gaze towards him, nodded slightly, and replied, "I was once so angry, I needed a dog to understand me more than people did." The air in the room seemed to shift. A small laugh nearly escaped from a corner, but was swallowed before it could rise. Echo lifted its head, its calm gaze sweeping the rows before returning to its handler, as if knowing that this quiet was the strongest answer. Serena said nothing more, did not steer the moment toward her past, did not retell the video that had been viewed millions of times, nor describe the eyes of Greer or Blake. No one in the room asked her to reopen the past, and Serena had no intention of turning pain into a framed lesson for others to dissect. Instead, she asked in return, if one day you were pulled to the ground, held down by those who were supposed to protect you, what would you do? No one answered immediately. The question hung in the air like a cold cut. Finally, from the back row, a boy slowly raised his hand and said in a small voice, "I think I'd stay silent, but my eyes would be wide open." Serena nodded and smiled lightly, not saying "that's right" or offering praise, only turning to look at Echo and saying it once did that. The dog did not wag its tail, did not growl. It only sat and opened its eyes wide. After the talk, when most people had stood and murmured their way toward the door, a group of female students lingered near Echo. They reached out hesitantly, no one speaking. Serena gave no signal and no reminder. Echo stepped forward on its own, sat down, and looked at each one in turn, its gaze slow, as if judging which of them could endure silence longer than it could. One girl spoke. "You don't talk as much as in the video," Serena replied, voice calm. "I didn't talk much in that video." The answer made them laugh, but the laughter faded quickly when another asked, "Do you think things have changed?" Serena looked into the distance toward the row of flags in the yard hanging still in the wind and said, "I don't know, but I know I've stayed myself. Not optimism, not pessimism, just a plain truth from someone who had gone through something that could not be rebuilt by any speech." On the way out of the hall, an elderly teacher approached. Her thin hand clasped Serena's, and she whispered, "Thank you for not turning that story into a performance." Serena nodded her eyes, not on anyone's hand, but still following Echo, walking slowly ahead, its gait, steady tail, neither wagging nor tuck. Outside, the sky had turned a pale bronze. The air was lightly damp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves from the schoolyard and the scent of soil after the rains. In that moment, no one clapped, no one left midway, no one pulled out a phone to take pictures or record, no one asked for an autograph. They simply stood watching the two figures, one person, one dog, moving down the empty hallway. Footsteps echoed on the tile floor, steady and unhurried. There were no elaborate thank yous, no forced smiles. From the crowd, a man in a dark coat, with the solid build of a veteran, bent down, placed a hand on Echo's head as if touching a milestone, then walked straight on without looking back. An elderly woman on a cane came closer, eyes glistening, her trembling hand resting on Echo's shoulder before she turned to Serena. Without words, her eyes sent an overdue apology, perhaps for an entire generation that had stayed silent when it should not have. Serena sat still, watching each person pass, nodding, when needed keeping Echo close at her side. She did not smile, did not appear moved. Her expression stayed the same, calm, alert, steady, the steadiness of someone who knows the value of silence. When nearly everyone had gone, a middle-aged man in a worn shirt approached. He did not hurry, nor did he linger. Before passing Echo, he leaned slightly toward Serena and said very softly, "Thank you for staying silent." It's louder than a shout. The words were as light as breath, yet they fell into the space like a weighted touch. Serena looked at him briefly, did not answer, and only lowered her head slowly. Echo lifted its head in turn, its gaze still steady, still calm. When Echo stood, Serena gently pulled the leash. The dog did not rush, but turned to look back at the hall, the room now lit only by the dim yellow glow of the day's last bulbs. Rows of empty chairs scattered shoe prints on the tile floor, a few fallen sheets of paper left behind. All of it formed a scene of post-silence, unglamorous, but true. On the wall, the painted words, "Freedom comes from discipline," had faded, but to Serena they were as clear as the first day. She needed no recognition, no title. The only thing she wanted was to leave this place without anyone avoiding her gaze, without anyone quickening their steps out of fear of Echo or of her. They left the school gates as the sky deepened, the sunset spreading like a streak of red ash at the end of the day. Serena walked slowly, Echo close beside her, the leash loose. Wind moved through the roadside trees, leaves rustled underfoot, and in that open space no one said a word. But for the first time in a long while, Serena felt a silence that did not mean being silenced or dismissed. It was mutual acknowledgement, needing no explanation. On a nearby wall, someone had once written in black paint, "Justice starts when someone stays calm while the world loses its voice." Serena glanced at it without stopping, but Echo paused for a few seconds as if reading each word before moving on. That companionship needed no commands, only the unspoken understanding between two beings who had known battlefields and had once been treated as tools but had learned to exist without losing their moral ground. The gathering ended, but its impact did not lie in moving quotes or viral posts. It lay in the fact that from this day on those who had been there would understand sometimes staying silent is not enduring. It is a choice stronger than any words of defiance. And Echo, without the sound of applause, still held its head high as it walked, as if it and no one else was guarding the line between justice and power. Echo was retired on a windless day with no military ceremony, no lowered flag or sounding bell. Only Serena walking the dog through the gate of the old training ground. They didn't look back. Echo had fulfilled his duty. And for Serena, the only thing left to do was to never place another in the position he once held. She didn't take in a new dog, didn't register a replacement, and didn't stay active in special intervention units. What needed protecting, Echo had protected. What needed proven, Echo had proved. What needed remembering, Serena would remember. She didn't explain it to anyone, but those who had witnessed the incident understood that Dog didn't need a successor. He deserved to retire like a veteran, not be replaced like a tool. Sometime later, Serena opened a small center in the suburbs. No flashy signs, no loud promotion, just a simple wooden house with a low fence and a wide stretch of grass. On a wooden board hanging by the gate was a hand-carved message, "Listen before you command." She welcomed local kids to learn how to care for and train dogs, not through militarized methods or control by force, but through understanding and patience. The first lessons were always the same. Don't make the dog do anything. Learn to sit down and watch it first. For Serena, that was a life philosophy. For the kids, it was the first time they were taught that power isn't in how loud you shout, but in how well you listen to what isn't being said. Echo, though older, still joined Serena every day at the training ground, not performing, not following commands, just walking among the children, lying still when needed, occasionally looking up at anyone who spoke too loudly or moved too fast. The kids quickly understood that when Echo looked at you, it meant you should stop, not out of fear, but because his gaze seemed to say, "You've crossed cross the line. One boy once asked Serena, "How long did it take you to train him to understand people like that?" Serena just smiled. "I didn't train him to understand people. I learned how to make him want to trust me first." Her center gradually became a place for adults who had lost control of themselves, parents who had hit their kids in anger, teachers who had yelled when they felt helpless. They didn't come to learn how to teach a dog to sit, but to relearn how to be silent and observe. Serena didn't use words like morality or, quote, lofty ideas about compassion. She just placed them in an open yard with a dog and let them learn from scratch what limits meant. Once, a retired soldier visited, sat quietly for hours, just watching Echo circle the yard, and finally said, "He doesn't need to command anyone to be in control. He's just present, and that's enough." One afternoon, under an overcast sky as the rain threatened to fall, a little girl around 8 years old walked up to Echo and asked, "What if he's not alive anymore? Who will protect us?" Serena didn't answer right away. She looked at Echo, the dog, lying beside a patch of grass, ears perked as if still listening to everything around, then bent down and looked the girl in the eyes. "You'll protect yourself if you learn to sit still and listen before deciding what's right." The child nodded, then ran off, leaving Serena alone beside Echo in the quiet space between two generations. That evening, under the soft yellow light in the living room, Serena wrote a note to prepare for the next day's lesson. Teaching a dog when to stop is easy. Teaching a human when not to act is the hardest part. She pinned that note to the bulletin board in the training room, not for the students, but for herself, to remember that justice in the end isn't something you clap for at the end of a trial, but something you repeat every day until no one needs to be reminded anymore. And each morning, as long as Echo still opened his eyes and took slow but steady steps out to the field, Serena knew her work wasn't done, because there were still children who needed to learn that a dog isn't meant to guard or attack, but to remind us that some things aren't written in books, yet they're the most important lessons in life. Lessons no one teaches from a podium, no one gets promoted for, no one receives medals for. Only a woman who once held her silence and a dog who never stepped out of line. Two beings like that had taught an entire generation how to stand still when it mattered. When a reporter visited the center on its 2-year anniversary, he asked Serena if she ever regretted not fighting back when she was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, held at gunpoint, and insulted by those who claimed to uphold the law. Serena didn't dodge the question. She simply looked up, met his eyes, and said calmly, "I did fight back. I just didn't have to shout." That answer wasn't an excuse nor a declaration. It was a simple truth enough to make even the reporter fall silent for a moment, as if realizing that resistance doesn't always take the shape of screams or violence. Sometimes it's the ability to remain still when others are trying to pull you apart. Echo sat beside her, then, as steady as always, his gaze drifting quietly over the visitor and back toward the gate, as if he already knew the conversation didn't need to go on. On the wooden board outside the yard where most visitors pass, before entering one line was carved deep, unframed, without decoration. Training a dog means teaching it not to bite. Training a human is the opposite. Some people laughed when they read it, others felt a chill, and most said nothing. But no one left that place without being haunted by the words. The more they thought about it, the more they realized what's truly frightening in this society isn't animal instinct, but the way humans justify their actions with titles like power, discipline, or duty. And that's why the lessons here, whether it's how to hold a leash, how to observe instead of command, or how to step back instead of charging forward, have become a mirror reflecting the chaos in the artificial order outside. Serena never explained further. She never ran large classes, never hired assistants, never applied for any state-funded programs. The center kept operating quietly with Echo at its core, and children slowly learning how to live without shouting at others just to prove they were right. Many former police officers, soldiers, and security personnel also came not to learn how to train dogs, but to relearn how to hold themselves back before making a decision. One of them once admitted during a quiet conversation, I realized I'm not afraid of the gunfire. I'm afraid of myself when I hold the gun. Serena didn't object or add anything. She just looked toward Echo, lying on the front step, his tail flicking slightly in reaction to something no one else in the room had noticed. The silence between them wasn't awkward, and it wasn't a lesson. It was the clearest reminder that some wounds don't need blood to change someone forever. And if any lesson remained after everything, it was this: the ability to preserve your dignity without turning yourself into someone who resists out of rage. That lesson isn't in textbooks nor in training manuals. It exists only in the eyes of someone who has been humiliated without losing self-respect, and in the raised head of a loyal dog staring back at those who once trampled its owner's honor. And so each evening, as the sun tilted behind the back gate, Echo would lie beside the steps, like always, eyes fixed on the unlocked gate, while Serena quietly tidied up the training ground. She didn't need applause. She didn't need anyone to validate her silent resistance. The only thing she needed was a place where justice didn't have to be shouted, just taught from the beginning with a leash, a timely word, and an unwavering gaze. In the paper-thin dusk, Serena sat on the front steps of the training center, her hand resting lightly on Echo's head. The dog was old now, but his eyes were still sharp and alert, just like on the first day he stepped into the conflict between authority and human dignity. Their journey didn't begin with a war, but with what seemed like a harmless confrontation where shouts and suspicious looks had become the dominant language on the street. Serena, a black woman and former soldier, had once been cornered, insulted, and held at gunpoint by two officers named Blake and Greer men who wore the badge as if character was something you could remove along with your uniform at the end of the day. And then, when Echo stepped forward, not with teeth, but with perfect control in every step, the balance began to shift. The story didn't erupt with gunfire, but with the composure of the person holding the leash, with the calm gaze of a dog trained not to resist even when it could. When the video of the incident spread, the public didn't just see a woman being oppressed, they saw a silent form of resistance stronger than any loud argument. In the hearings, Blake and Greer tried to flip the narrative, blaming Echo, blaming Serena, blaming anyone but themselves. But evidence from body cameras, testimony from experts, and Echo's steady gaze that never left them dismantled all that false authority. The quiet nods from the public, the heavy silences at press conferences, and the officials' eventual admission of fault all proved that justice doesn't come from who shouts louder, but from who holds their dignity longer. After the incident, Serena turned down millions in compensation, declined every speaking offer, and passed on a chance to join the investigative force. She chose instead to open a small center teaching kids how to train dogs, which was really about teaching them how to control emotion, how to step back before anger takes over. She didn't preach, didn't retell her story in grand speeches. She let images speak, a dog lying next to a sign that read, "Protect and Serve," a former officer walking through the same neighborhood where she had once been handcuffed without bitterness, and a child holding a canine training book with a handwritten note, "Skill isn't for attack, it's for knowing when to step back." What followed wasn't a victory, it was a consequence. The two officers received suspended sentences, their badges revoked. They walked out of court with faces quieter than when they entered. The police chief publicly apologized to Serena, bowing his head at a press conference with a statement that shocked the public. "I let the wrong man act against the right one." Echo licked Serena's hand like a silent confirmation. A journalist captured the moment and wrote under the photo, "Loyal instinct," but to the right person. The sign outside the training center still reads, "Training a dog is teaching it not to bite. Training in humans is the opposite. It's not just a teaching philosophy, but a distilled declaration about a system where the instinct for power overruled reason about a society that needs to relearn how to hold the leash of morality. A police academy added the case to its curriculum. One trainee asked, "How do you know when you're abusing your power?" The instructor replied, "When the other person is silent and you still feel threatened." The lesson in this story doesn't lie in speeches or verdicts. It's in how Serena responded. No retaliation, no provocation, no avoidance. She let the truth speak, let Echo stand as a living witness to a justice system warped by bias and presumption. Her silence at the right moment echoed louder than any accusation, and Echo's gaze without barking exposed the core of a society that at times only needs the flimsiest excuse to point a gun at someone. In the end, when Echo was honored by the National Canine Organization, someone asked, "Can another dog be trained like that?" The trainer replied, "Technically, yes, but ethics have to come from the one holding the leash." That was the answer to the entire system, that even with law, guns, and procedures, if the person holding the leash lacks integrity, everything is just violence dressed in legal uniform. The story of Serena and Echo didn't call for rebellion, nor did it preach kindness. It simply left one final image: a woman walking a dog through the very places that once humiliated her in silence, and receiving quiet nods not because she won, but because she refused to become like them. It was a victory without an anthem, without applause, but deep enough to change how a generation thinks about justice, power, and the kind of resolve that doesn't need to raise its voice. And lasting enough to remind us that in a world constantly demanding reactions, knowing when to stand still is sometimes the bravest thing you can do.